I am at my mom's home for the weekend, helping out with some various things, and one of the projects I'm working on is making an upgrade to her wood stove. This is a stove that's been here for 12 years or so. It does a pretty decent job of heating the home, but it consumes a lot of wood to keep the house warm, and if it were fed outside air for its combustion air, it would actually be able to positively pressurize the home. And so I'm going to help set up a system where it can get its combustion air from the outside world. And let me explain why I would want to do that. So this wood stove, just like any other wood stove, needs air to burn. Oxygen is a requirement for combustion. And so by default, the exhaust gases would go up the chimney. I'm not going to change that at all. But the incoming gases, by default on most wood stoves, just come in from the home, right around the wood stove. And what that ultimately means is that if there's a little crack where cold air can come in through a poorly insulated seam between an original home and an extension, which is the case there, this metal becomes ice cold in the winter because the vacuum of the wood stove draws air through that little air space from the outside to get the air it needs. Or any little cracks in the windows or little issues where there's lack of insulation or there's lack of air sealing, the wood stove would get its air from that. We can change that. Not every wood stove would have this, but this one does. The bottom of this wood stove has a 3-inch hole, and when the stove is running full bore, that hole feels as though it's like a shop vacuum that's on. There's a huge amount of vacuum. There's air rushing into this, which then goes into the combustion area, gets burnt up, and leaves out the chimney pipe. This is a place that is extreme negative pressure, and it's where the air for the stove comes in. If we connect directly to that, to the outside world, then the stove will be able to positively pressurize the home. But so the first part is basically figuring out a way to get this wood stove the air from the outside. Now this is an interior wall. We're not to the outside right there. So I actually have to route this through the basement a little bit. It would be a lot simpler in a more straightforward scenario where this stove is right up against an exterior wall. It doesn't look all that different. In fact, from the front and from most of the sides, it doesn't look that different. But back behind where we store the firewood, so this will go back over there and hide this tube. There is now some rigid ductwork. We're taking out an old heating system from our home, so I just reclaimed the rigid ductwork and then mated it up to flexible ductwork and taped that on using high heat aluminum tape. It's a super aggressive tape and it bites on and holds really well. At any hardware store, they'd have the flexible ductwork. It's normally around the place where they have dryer vents, and this would be the kind of tape. It's tolerant of really, really high heat and really cold heat, and the adhesive is very strong. This is the tape I used on our wood stove 7 years ago, and it still is holding tight. So the ductwork we scavenged from our home where we were getting rid of it, but you could buy that new if you wanted. This flexible ductwork was about $1 to a foot, and the tape I probably used about $1 worth. So in total we used $2 or $3 worth of materials, and now the stove will be breathing directly from this space. My original plan was to have the ductwork go through the wall and be routed down through the basement out through an exterior window. What I realized is that this wall here, when I was trying to drill through it, is almost 2 feet thick. It's a space between the original home and this addition on the home. And so rather than trying to route it through and drill through original exterior wall, I routed into that space. I noticed that there was cold air already running in that space, which is not ideal, but this way the stove is getting its air ultimately from the outside. I can feel this is already on the cooler side because it's talking directly to outside air. In an ideal world, I would have routed it all the way through. It just did not feel reasonable with the realities of how much complexity there was between this and the original home. Again, if this was an exterior wall and you could penetrate all the way out, put a 1/2-inch hardware cloth to keep rodents out, that would be the best of the best. But this is an absolute upgrade for just a few bucks and about 20 minutes of work. It's the first running of the stove with the new air input, and it's not as though the stove burns in some dramatically different way, but looking at the stack outside, it's running really nice and clean. Importantly, when I open the door to add more wood, it's not making more smoke at all come into the house, so the air is coming in unrestricted and allowing the stove to burn the way it needs to. And my mom said it feels like it's burning a little bit more even and feeling warmer already. The things to observe from here, now that we know that the basic function of the stove is what it needs to be, we really won't notice the huge impact of this, the upgrade of having external air being fed into the stove, until we start getting into much colder nights, especially windy nights, where the stove is running really intensely and where it used to draw in its cold air, its consumption air from, for example, this crack. This would be what I'll be testing for. So rather than doing sciencey stuff, it's more empirical. When it's cold out, I'll be feeling this, and I'm expecting that this will be a lot less colder because less air will be getting drawn in from here because it's coming in directly to the back of the stove through that tube. A number of years ago, this addition was added on, and it was really poorly insulated, and I think very poorly mounted to the original home, and so this is another area. At some point, I need to take these boards off and really get deeper and down into it. But it used to be that cold air would rush in, especially from here. We tried to caulk that up, but in other words, lots and lots of little gaps that for all these years have been where the wood stove's air, consumption air, has been coming from. You'd be sitting in a chair and feeling the cold air sliding past you over your feet towards the stove. And that's the big question, and I think the answer would be yes. Does that tube reduce the desire of the stove to breathe from everywhere in the house and really hone its focus into just that one tube? That's it for now on this video. Let me know if you have questions. I'm certainly open to feedback. And of course, I acknowledge that the absolute best thing I could have done would have been drilled through the wall, chased it all the way out, and found truly the outside. And if somebody were to try this and they had access to that, that would be the best. But routing it directly into a space that is an intersectional space between the original home and the new part of the home where cool air already is, that's outside of our living space, feels like a nice way to split the difference effort-wise. So just acknowledging that that's not the best of the best, but it's better than nothing. Next project, which will be a different video, is setting up, this a little bit more technical, a little bit of a blower fan with a temperature controller. My plan is to create an aluminum shield in the back and have air forced up through this rear space so it pushes the hot air out into the house. We'll talk about that in another video. Little upgrades here and there go a long way towards making a home comfortable for an older woman trying to keep herself warm and cozy. So hopefully this goes a long way towards that.